Good morning, folks. We are learning the deeper meaning of Chanukah. Chanukah is so much more than presents, so much more than just interesting foods. There's an entire ecosystem of ideas that is at play, in which Chanukah is the most difficult Jewish holiday for us to win. The reason why it's such a difficult holiday for us to be victorious on is because we're still fighting that battle. You see, every other nemesis that we face try to kill us and we vanquish them. But when it came to Chanukah, the Greeks were not trying to kill us, they were trying to assimilate us. And we're still living today in a world where we're struggling with the influence of secular and modern culture that tries to schlep us away from our faith values, from the courage to believe in one God and to commit our thought, speech, and action, our TSA, to the will of Hashem, to fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs, because we're struggling with modernity, with the seductive allure of modernity. That's why Chanukah is such a struggle for us. It's like a war that's still pending. We explained last week, we're on page 335 in the discourse by the previous Rabbi. We explained last week, last time we learned, that we introduced the Talmud in Tractate Shabbos 21b, that talks about the Chanukah. It gives us everything that we know about Chanukah. It comes from this piece of Talmud. It says that the Chanukah was all about the oil. It says that the Greeks tried to destroy the oil, they didn't try to destroy the oil, they tried to defile the oil. And that the victory of Chanukah was that the Maccabees managed to find one jar of oil. And that's why when this jar burned for 8 days, that became a festival for all time. It's all about the oil. And that's why we eat the oily foods and we light the candles. Chanukah is all about the oil. There's no mention here. There's just a very slight reference to a victory over the Greeks. So when you learned in Hebrew school that Chanukah is about the Jewish war against the Greeks, it's not entirely accurate, because that's not the celebration of Chanukah. You know, we can't make a yontiv every time we beat an anti-Semite. We wouldn't get any work done, right? You know, if we had to make a Jewish holiday every single time we neutralized or disarmed an anti-Semite, there would be like no work days the entire year. We go from one holiday to another holiday, just getting fat of all sorts of interesting foods, right? So we just can't afford this anymore. You know, we reached a max on Jewish holidays. But when it comes to Chanukah, that's not what we're celebrating. Chanukah is an existential war, not because they were trying to kill our bodies, but because they were trying to assimilate our souls. Let's take a look at this idea in the words of the previous Rebbe on page 335. We spoke about it generally last session, but let's go look at it now in the original words of the previous Rebbe. Rashi explains the Gemara's question: what is Chanukah? What does it mean when the Gemara says, my Chanukah? What is Chanukah? The Gemara desires to know, says Rashi, what miraculous event was responsible for this holiday? The rabbis teach that the 25th day of Kislev is the beginning of the 8-day Chanukah festival, for the reason just mentioned, that will now be elaborated upon. All ritual items used in the Holy Temple had to first be carefully inspected to ensure that they were without blemish. The animals and birds used for sacrificial offerings had to be healthy beyond the shadow of a doubt. If there was any illness in the animals, they were considered, you know what the word was? Treif, right. So an animal which is already dead is called a nevela, a carcass. An animal that's going to die within the next 12 months is called a treifa. Any living thing that has got less than 12 months to live is called a treifa. So it looks alive, but it's really sick. It's got a mortal sickness, and that's why it's called a treifa. That's where the original origin of the word treif comes from. Tearing? You're probably talking about the word glut. Glut is about removing the adhesions from the lung. That's a different word. Okay. Not only did the animals that were offered as offerings in the temple needed to be perfect from any blemish or illness, the wood, and by the way, when I was studying my rabbinical degree, we learned the laws of Trefus. It was a little bit out there, We had to learn about three-legged chickens, and we had to. I remember we went to the abattoir. We had to insert our arms down the gullets of the cow to feel for the lungs. Oh, it wasn't nothing I wanted to specialize in, right? Anyways, well, you have to experience it, because you got to know what is an illness. If you find a needle in certain parts of the body, it makes it a treifa. If there's certain illnesses in the brain, certain illnesses, this is animal pathology that we were dealing with. The wood used on the altar also had to be completely free of worms or rot. The various types of flour for offerings had to be meticulously sifted. The wines used in conjunction with the various offerings had to be free of sediment. And the oil for the menorah needed to be of the highest and most select quality. Concerning oil, the Torah says the oil in the temple, that it must be both zach, pure, and kosis, which means crushed.
What?
Crushed. Pressed. It's got to be pure and pressed. What does that mean? The Gemara explains that zach, pure, means clean, and kosis means pressed, because there are 9 grades of oil that can be extracted from olives. Did you know this? 9 grades of oil.
Yeah.
I never understood what
Yeah.
extra virgin olive oil means. So what does that mean?
The first press.
Right. Evidently, it's more than a regular virgin. It's an extra virgin,
Right.
right? So there's obviously different levels, right? There's a cold press. I'm assuming that means that there's probably a hot press at some point.
I got an oil maven right here.
Oh, you're an oil maven.
No,
Those are 9 different types.
but I know there are 9 different types of oil.
Oh, you do know that there's 9 different types of oil. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. My brother-in-law got married in Fuji. You know what Fuji is? Acqua di Fuji. You ever heard of that? It's near Rome. It's about an hour from Rome, where the Roman emperors had a summer palace. The waters of Fuji are considered very healing. Acqua di Fuji. So he got married over there, and one of the nights of the wedding, they held a party, which was different kinds of tomatoes. Italian or tomatoes. In American, you say tomatoes, yeah. Different kinds of tomatoes, and there were different kinds of olive oils. It's very, very interesting, the infusions and the various, the balsamic, and there's the Tuscan is olive oil with lemon juice, and then there's the basil infused, whatever, right? So there's different kinds of olive oil. Those, of course, are added. But when you're talking about the pure olive oil, and we had actually somebody here in the community who went to Italy, and he went to crush the olives himself. And he brought back like a gallon of the most viscous, beautiful olive oil. It was like the first, the highest quality, I guess. Anyways, why we're mentioning this, there are 9 grades of oil that can be extracted from olives, but for the menorah, only the 3 finest grades were used. Only the top 3 were allowed to be used for the menorah. The oil was therefore one of the costliest items in the Holy Temple. Now, in addition to the fact that the oil needed to be meticulously prepared as the top 3 of the 9 grades of oil, it also needed to be spiritually protected to keep it pure, right? As is known, all these items, flour, wine, oil, and vessels, were to be kept from coming in contact with a ritually impure object or person. What is a ritually impure object? Or a person? Well, it starts with a person. A dead person. Only a dead Jewish person, by the way, is impure. A dead non-Jewish person is not impure. Interesting. Yeah. But a dead person. So let's say if you came from a cemetery, this is the reason why someone like Warren, it's a Kohen, would be careful not to go into a cemetery or even a hospital, unless he has to, for medical reasons. A Kohen,
Because it's Kohen.
a Kohen is right. A Kohen is of elevated status. A Kohen doesn't just get the first aliyah. What? Yeah. Marty, make sure that you know who you're talking to here, right? So
anywhere where there's a dead body, so you can't even go to the memorial service.
Correct.
Because the casket.
Correct. You can't. Ron over here, Ron in our show, he never goes to a funeral. Never goes because he can't. What?
A Kohen can't go to the funeral?
Correct.
No, not
Even
even-
of his own.
Can you
Not
imagine?
even
I try to hire a rabbi
Own
here.
family?
I tried to hire a junior rabbi a couple years ago, and the guy tells me, everything is looking good. Towards the end of the discussions, he says, "By the way, I'm a Kohen." I'm like, "1 second, you're a Kohen, so that means you don't do hospitals, you don't do funerals. What do you do?"
You can't go to hospital?
Well, think about it. If there's a morgue in the hospital, if in the entire structure, if somebody's died,
There's a morgue down.
Oh,
then
that's-
then it becomes
Yeah, but I've heard it. I know that some of the rabbis in Chicago, when they would do a memorial service, like at Weinstein's, they would stand, the door where like the people, the family comes in from, they would stand out there and deliver and conduct the service, so they wouldn't be in the room with the dead body.
So what that means is that's a little more advanced, which is very nice, where they actually create a separate structure. So they create it in a way where there's, if it's all under the same roof, then even though it's 20,000 square feet away, it doesn't matter. Under the same roof, the coffin would extend impurity under the entire roof. But if there's a separate structure which has a separate roof that's not connected, then the Kohen can stand in that room and not and not be impurified. Now, what's interesting also, I remember like in London, there's certain streets where they have trees that overhang the cemeteries. So the Kohanim are careful not to drive on those streets because those streets are, the tree extends the impurity from the cemetery over to that sidewalk. You see what I'm saying? I mean, there was actually, if you've ever heard, there was a great sage, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, in the Galilee, 2,000 years ago, who identified the locations of the graves through Kabbalistic X-ray vision. He was able to identify where the graves were to allow the priests to walk without them feeling like they couldn't walk anywhere, right? So this idea of impurity is a very, very interesting component of Jewish law, which we know very little about today. And the reason why you're shaking your head.
What's that?
It's a coke. It's not used to coke.
Yeah, he's not used to chucks. That's right.
Back home in Virginia,
Coke.
It's
the
a hook.
building we used was a form of funeral home.
There's really-
The building you used, was formerly a funeral home.
Originally, it was a funeral home.
Okay, but I'm sure they removed the dead people, I'm hoping, before they moved in. So
So can I, are there any rabbis who are Kohens? Because it seems like.
absolutely.
Okay, and,
They just don't do hospitals and funerals,
oh, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
which is interesting. I mean, you want to be there for people, It's a little challenging. But it's interesting. I called my cousin up. I'm like, "You're a Cohen. How do you do this?" He said, "I just don't do it."
And your congregation understand.
But let me just elaborate here a little bit. We don't know much about
That's
this.
when you need the rabbi the most. We need to understand.
Yeah.
Sure.
Look, maybe you might want to try another profession if you're.
sick. That's why we got the rabbi.
Look, let me say this. Here in Shul, guys,
It's like my lunch doesn't do windows.
here in Shul, when somebody comes to Shul and he has a yard site, we don't say to him, "By the way, are you impure?" We don't do that. We don't ask them. You haven't been to a cemetery in 7 days, right? Right. We don't ask people this question. Like here in America, they say, "Have you been out of the country in the past 3 months or something?" Right, for all these diseases. But in modern Judaism, we don't ask this question, and the reason that it doesn't really matter is because you're allowed to walk into a shul if you're impure. You're pretty much allowed to do anything today in a state of impurity. What you're not allowed to do in a state of impurity is to enter into the complex of the Holy Temple. You're not allowed to enter into the Holy Temple in a state of impurity. And there are multiple kinds of impurities. There are impurities that are associated not only with the dead person, but even with, let's say, semen. So if you've engaged in intercourse, then there is a certain shortened form of impurity. If you've touched a rodent, there are 8 different biblical rodents. What are they, like a chameleon, a weasel, a rat? I forget exactly what they are, but there's a list of 8.
Intercourse with, that's something to do with it also.
What's that? Who you have an intercourse
Yeah,
with?
yeah, that's
I
something to
don't
do
know
with
about
it.
that.
So there's a massive swath of Jewish law, which is the laws of purity and impurity, which again today it doesn't really manifest. And by the way, have you ever heard of the red heifer, the red cow?
Sure.
So what's this red cow? We learn about the red cow, that you got to find the red cow and you got to keep it in a special way that it's not ever allowed to carry a yoke. And then you got to slaughter it, and you got to take its ashes and you got to sprinkle it upon who? Upon the person who was impurified by a dead person. And then what happens is that the person who was impure becomes pure. The person who was pure, sprinkling, becomes impure. Right? It's like a tag your it kind of thing, right? So this stuff makes no sense. Makes no sense, admittedly. And like Harvey just pointed out, this is one of the irrational components of Judaism. One of the irrational components of Judaism, where we do it only because that's what God said. Right? There are, when you respect the higher power, you submit to their will, even if you don't understand them. For example, in America, there are things that we do that we don't understand or don't even agree with. Maybe they run opposite to our understanding, and we still comply because we live in the United States of America. It's part of the benefits of living in this country. So maybe you don't like paying taxes. Maybe you don't agree that you should be paying taxes. Maybe you shouldn't be paying this much taxes. But it comes to the territory. You say, look, I don't understand it, but I'm going to do it because this is what I have to do, right?
God didn't really write this all down.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that God didn't write this all down?
I don't know.
Not about taxes.
No, about the impurity.
How do you know?
How do I know?
How do you know that God didn't write it down?
I don't know.
Can't prove a negative.
Huh?
You can't prove a negative.
He gave it to Moses.
Didn't seem like.
The cemetery cannot go into a shul. Is that what you just said?
That what?
The person who just came from the cemetery cannot walk into a shul.
I did not say that. I said we don't ask that question. A person today it doesn't apply, but in biblical times it would. If you walked into the cemetery, you could not go into the Holy Temple in Jerusalem.
The holy
No,
temple.
I
You
understand
don't.
the Holy Temple, but is that the reason why we wash our hands after we leave the cemetery?
Yeah, that is exactly the reason why you wash your hands after the cemetery. It's a miniature form of mikvah to remind ourselves. And by the way, it's the same exact reason why we wash our hands before bread. Why do we wash our hands before bread? The reason that we wash our hands before bread, we go 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3 with a bucket of water. The reason is to remind ourselves that even though we're in a state of exile, where we don't have a temple, and we don't have laws that separate the pure from the impure, right? And that we don't, by the way, this is a big thing when it comes to having guests. Because if you're a Kohen, there are certain foods that only Kohens are allowed to eat. You have a good time today?
Just having a good time.
There's only certain foods.
Check his-
There are certain foods. For
He's cutting
example,
off.
you come to the Holy Temple. You break.
He's not a Kohen.
Are you sure you're not a Kohen? You might be.
You wanna
So-
do that?
So you come to the Holy Temple and you bring an offering. Let's say you bring an offering to the Holy Temple. You bring an offering of thanksgiving, right? So you burn parts of the animal upon the altar. Other parts of the animal are allowed to be eaten by you. But there are certain parts of the animal that have to be eaten by the priest because they're holy. It's like the shoulder, the cheeks, and the liver. I think it is. There's different parts of the body that are sanctified. Now they go to the priest. Now the priest can't just say to his buddies, "Yeah, come on over, guys. We're gonna have some biltong. We're gonna have some whatever." He can't invite his friends over because if you're not a Kohen, you're not allowed to eat that food. Do you see what I'm saying?
Chop liver you can.
So back to we wash our hands before bread.
Oh, sorry.
because-
So why do we wash our hands before bread? To remind ourselves that even though we're in a state of exile where it doesn't really matter today whether you're pure or impure because you don't have a holy temple, nevertheless, it reminds us that certain foods need to be eaten in a state of purity. And therefore, bread, which is the most important food, is the only food with which we purify ourselves prior to eating it by doing a miniature form of a mikvah, which is a purification bath, by pouring the water over the hands in that sequence. So we're purifying our hands in order to prepare ourselves to eat the bread in a state of semi-purity, so that we always remember that when Mashiach comes today, the Messiah comes and rebuilds our temple, we won't say, 1 second, what's this purity thing we never heard about? We'll know that there's a rule that certain foods need to be eaten in purity. And to your point, Chuck, to your question, to your incredulous question that God didn't possibly say this to us, right?
They were pretty busy to write down infinite rules and laws.
No, but he's infinite.
Listen, there's perks to being almighty, you know.
I guess.
You were there.
Let me just answer this
You were
question.
there.
There's perks to being almighty because, you know, if you're almighty, then you could do infinite stuff, right? That's the start. But the second thing I want to tell you, Chuck, is that, you know, it would actually not make sense for God to create the world and then not bother to give us any instructions.
The manual.
If he's going to go to the effort of creating this world, instead of allowing us to grope in the darkness, it actually makes sense that he would take the time to give us some sort of a user's manual that we can read. Now,
Quite the manual.
it's quite the manual. And the problem is that it's so enigmatic, as we learned in a course called Book Smart, in the Book Smart seminar, where we learned about, you did Book Smart, right? About all the different parts of the Torah. There's so many kinds of books and genres of Torah. There's the written Torah, there's the hidden, the secret Torah, there's the oral Torah. There's so many books that incorporate the Torah. It's intense. It's a lot. Yeah, and this is just a little tiny window of the library that's out there. So I'm just saying to you, Chuck, that you got to make peace with the fact that if God is able to be the creator of the universe, then He's also good enough to write a book.
But the laws of purity saved us like from the plagues because we were washing our hands. Then the goyim got angry.
This is a
Right?
very technical benefit that Harvey's observing. Thank you for posting the Booksmart link here, Winston, to our group. When it came to the spread of cholera, the Black Plague, the Jews were dying in far, far less numbers than the Gentiles. So they actually accused the Jews of poisoning the wells and being responsible for the spreading of the plague. When in truth, what happened was the poor Jews, Nebuch, where they would just wash. We always wash. We could wash our hands. We wake up in the morning because of purity reasons. By the way, we wash our hands after the bathroom for purity reasons. We wash our hands before bread for purity reasons. We're constantly washing our hands. When these guys were taking baths, I think once in 6 months, it was considered like healthy to take a bath once in 6 months. We were dealing with fresh water all the time. I mean, Maimonides 850 years ago was talking about the importance of sewage. Of removing sewage and dirty water. The Talmud 2,000 years ago talks about the danger of sitting downwind during a plague. During a plague, can you imagine how dangerous that is when there's a plague? And understanding that there's such a thing as airborne illnesses. But back onto this idea here. So yes, sir. Wine.
So you wash before bread. Why don't you wash before you have some wine?
Your hands
Wine
don't
is
touch
pretty
the
holy
wine.
too, yeah.
They touch the bread.
You know what? I'm glad you're not on the suggestions committee. Because
God's suggestions to me.
there actually was a decree. There was a group of rabbis that were trying to make a special decree on oil. They made a decree on wine that you're not allowed to drink wine that was seen by a Gentile.
Poured by a-
Yeah. So that became very, very technical when it came to hosting guests. It became very complicated. And there was another decree that they made on the purity of oil. Thankfully, the one about the oil didn't last because oil is in everything. And if we needed to worry about oil being sanctified, we'd be literally washing our hands every 15 seconds. So it's better. I'm just saying the answer to your question is it's enough to you what the Torah already prohibited you. You don't have to look for extra. That's what it says in the Talmud. You shouldn't look for extra restrictions to place upon yourself. Yeah.
Talking about the 9 grades of olive and
Yeah.
3 farms to use. Why 3? Why not 2 or 4? Why the number 3?
I don't know the answer to that question.
It's easy.
What?
3 is in the Sephirus is number.
Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes.
Combination of
Sounds good to me.
Hey, that's a good one.
All right, sounds good.
Thank
But
you,
I don't know the
Rabbi.
answer to that question. I'm not going to be able to sit here and tell you that I know why the 3. I didn't even know what the 9 grades of oil are. I wouldn't be able to recognize them with the if you paid me, I wouldn't be able to know what the 9 grades of oil are. So I don't know the answer. But let me just wrap this all up by saying the following. So just maybe we could just finish this paragraph. As is known, all these items, flour, wine, oil, and vessels, would be kept from coming in contact from a ritually impure object or person. For should they come in contact with impurity, they would be rendered unfit for service in the holy temple. So it's not enough that they had to be the highest physical grades. and free from worms and illnesses. They also needed to be free from exposure to any form of impurity. And there's a lot of forms of impurity. If you want to know, in the book, the brown books up there, the brown books, okay, is the books of Maimonides, is an entire book called the Book of Purity, Tahara. Maimonides, 850 years ago, was the one who put the Torah into an encyclopedia format. So you can actually read the Book of Purity, which lists every single kind of purity and impurity. It's up there nicely listed. Therefore, the oil selected for the menorah was placed in flasks, and the seal of the high priest was affixed to each one. The flasks were then stored in a special place. So this is what the Greeks were after. They were coming to defile the purified oil. And what we need to understand in subsequent lessons here is why the Greeks were after the oil, why the oil specifically. The key to the answer is going to be that they had a problem with impurity. They had a problem with things being impure because it made no sense to them. They liked a logical Judaism. They had no problem with a logical Judaism. It was the irrational components of Judaism that they were waging war against. They were not comfortable with us believing in an all-powerful God that is greater than our ability to comprehend. And that's what they were fighting the spiritual war against faith. Not against custom, not against the deed. It was against the creed. It was against the philosophy that there's an invisible God that is almighty and all-powerful and so much greater than our ability to process and understand. That impurity represented a surrender to a God that is infinitely greater than us. And that's what they wanted to break. The spiritual war, therefore, that we're waging today is to be able to have the courage of our own convictions and to believe in things that are hard to understand. For example, that God wrote the Torah. For us to say the land of Israel is ours because God gave it to us. How many of us are insecure about saying that statement in public? Well, you're a religious fanatic, right? No, stop the fear. Stop the fear. You've got to believe that God exists, that God also is able to write, right? God gave us the Torah, fundamentals of our faith. And in the Torah, he tells us explicitly that the Torah, that the land of Israel is an eternal gift to the Jewish people. So stop apologizing. So right there, we see how we're struggling. One little tiny example, how we are still struggling. We're so intimidated by the Greeks, the Hellenized forces around us that say that we have to only understand everything, as if the world around us behaves logically, as if the world around us is rational. Marching for Hamas makes no sense whatsoever on any level, impossible to justify. So the world has gone meshuggah in Gansen, entirely crazy. So that actually makes it easier for us to have faith in God, because when you realize how crazy they are in their irrational behaviors, you're like, you know what? I'll do my irrational behaviors. They're less irrational than your irrational behaviors. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Why did the Greeks defile the oil when they couldn't defile the flour, the wood, the wine? What was it about
The
that?
oil was the most spiritually sensitive item.
Why you couldn't without kosher wood? You couldn't.
So we're going to learn about the properties of oil, how oil the physical properties of oil rises to the top. It always rises to the top, and this represents faith that rides above reason. That was a physical manifestation of what they were fighting against. You'll see, we'll talk a lot about this, about the oil, how oil is that which seeps into everything, right? In order to grease your wheels, right? We'll talk about the significance of oil. It's a very beautiful concept. We do this on Tuesdays and Thursdays, God willing. All right, thank you all. Sure, absolutely.